Parricide is the murder of a parent or another near relative, and as of 2017, it accounted for only about 2% of all homicide cases, and it was predominantly carried out by single, middle-class men with no history of prior criminal acts, and the offenders were usually between 18 and 30 years old. Difficult relationships between the parent and the offender are usually a precursor to the killing. And there are 3 types of offenders: severely abused, mentally ill, and dangerously antisocial. Dangerously antisocial offenders usually kill because they see the parent as an obstacle to a goal or desire. Some of the previous cases of parricide on this podcast have been Lizzie Borden, episode 35, and Wesley Elkins, episode 28. He who does violence to his father and chases away his mother is a son who brings shame and reproach. Proverbs 19:26.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes.
Okay, so this is our second recording of the day, so we're still on the cup of coffee that you heard about last week.
Yes.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Who puts the toilet paper on in your bathroom?
Oh gosh, I did. Why?
You did it backwards.
That's so funny. I did it in a hurry when I was really tired.
That's funny.
There was like an empty roll.
Yeah.
Or, like the empty roll. And then and I was like, let me just do this real quick.
Well, I was thinking, I know Lily didn't do this.
No, it was me. Not Lily.
I'm an over the roll person, and this one's coming from the under the roll.
That is so funny.
If we're going to get controversial on this show, we'll have to maybe put a question in our Facebook group.
Yes.
Okay. I was looking at some headlines this week.
Yeah.
And I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of the Micah Miller case, that young pastor's wife here in North Carolina who took her own life. Mm-hmm. So sad, wasn't it?
It was terrible.
And, everybody was suspecting he had something to do with it, right?
Right.
But now we know that she called in before she took her own life and told them where they could find her in that state park. So have you heard the newest theories about this?
No.
Okay, I just read this a couple of days ago. There are some people who think that that call she made was really AI generated. That was not her voice. And AI can really sound like you. I've already had my son was showing it to me.
Yes.
So
that's a wild theory.
That is a wild theory, but there are people who are saying, yes, if you listen closely, you can tell there were some weird pauses. Now, again, if you're getting ready to take your life, I think there will be some hesitation in your voice.
Right.
And I haven't gone back and listened to make an opinion of my own. I'm just telling you what the theories are out there.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you had heard it.
No, I haven't. The only thing about that is that there was a fisherman nearby her.
Okay.
That had heard her crying out.
Oh.
And he heard a woman crying.
Yeah.
And he had heard the gunshot. And then he actually called in too. I mean, he knew something had happened.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, not that they couldn't have gotten somebody else to do that.
Well, or if somebody was holding her at gunpoint and she was crying.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so true.
So
that's true.
She could have been crying because they're getting ready to kill her. I mean,
that's so
again, that's a big speculation. What it makes me think of is we live in a scary world now, because if that's not the case here, I bet you there's not going to be too long before that is the case.
Oh, I know.
Think about it. I mean, that AI is some scary stuff to me.
That whole story was crazy. You should listen to that Allie Beth Stuckey.
Yes.
Did you listen to that about that case?
Not about that one, but I love listening to her podcast.
Well, she did a whole episode about that case. And it was really good. I just didn't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And she said some things. Those people were crooked.
Wow.
That church had some shady stuff going on.
Yeah. I mean, it sounded like it.
Yeah.
But I would definitely want to hear her take on it, because I love her podcast.
Yeah. She did a really good episode. So check it out.
Interesting. Okay. Well, my episode today, I don't know if you've heard of it or not. It's a fairly shorter one,
Yeah.
but very interesting.
Okay.
So let me just get this thing started.
Yeah.
On June 23rd, 1965, 2 Houston police officers responded to a call for a welfare check at 1815 Driscoll Street in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston. Marvin Martin had called the police after he had been unable to get his elderly aunt and uncle to answer their door or any phone calls. He lived near the couple and he usually did check on them regularly, and he just couldn't really think of any reason why they wouldn't come to the door.
Okay.
At first, he had gone over to the house. He knocked. He tried to look in the windows, but the blinds were closed. The house was locked up. He knew something was off. And so that's when he had notified authorities.
Okay.
When police had arrived at the house of Fred and Edwina Rogers, it was around 9 p.m. in the evening. Officers saw a neighbor outside and they inquired if they had seen or heard anything from the Rogers, but they said no, actually not in several days.
Okay.
So after receiving no answer at the door, they decided they would enter by force. They kicked in the door, but the house seemed to be empty. There was no sign of Fred, he was age 81, or Edwina, age 79. There was also no sign of their son Charles, the 43-year-old son that lived with them.
Okay.
Officers noticed that the yellow brick house was a bit untidy, littered with some magazines, a lot of old newspapers, dirty dishes. But Nephew Martin assured them this wasn't really out of the ordinary for the Rogers home. Apparently, Mrs. Rogers was like a poor housekeeper.
Yeah.
However, when they reached the kitchen, the uncleanliness was taken up a notch. Laid out on the table was a moldy dinner, one that had been prepared and never eaten or cleaned up. And the putrid odor coming from the refrigerator was almost unbearable.
Okay.
I'm sure the last thing they wanted to do was open that and let that smell out into the house even more, but they, for some reason, they did.
And it was in the refrigerator?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is odd.
Yeah.
And what they found was pretty bizarre. Shelves stacked full of what they thought was unwrapped hog meat.
Oh my gosh.
But things took a freakish turn when the officer looked into the crisper drawer and there was a human head staring back at him.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was a horrific scene. It was Edwina.
Oh my gosh.
And it was startling. So then they opened the freezer, and inside they found dismembered bodies cut up into small, unwashed pieces.
Oh my gosh.
At first, they thought it was just like one body. And so they laid some black plastic out on the table and they start pulling out body parts, sorting through them, trying to put everything in order. When they come to the realization that it wasn't just one person, it was 2 people.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, they had never been expecting anything this gruesome at just, at a simple welfare check.
Yes.
Especially not in the neighborhood they were in. It was a neighborhood of families and, little cafes and restaurants. And Montrose was considered a good, safe neighborhood.
We'll be back after a quick break.
At the beginning of this year, one of my New Year's resolutions was to get my home decluttered and organized, especially my kitchen. Just going in there felt daunting. Even family meals were no longer enjoyable. I knew that I needed help because the thought of tackling it on my own was overwhelming. And then Melody told me about Shannon over at Functional Spaces. And let me tell you that meeting her transformed my kitchen from a cluttered mess to a cozy functional space that I once again can take pleasure in.
Everyone has that one chaotic area in their home that requires excessive time and energy to manage. Many of us can identify more than one. For Darlene, that was just inside her kitchen door.
Yes, everybody would come in and throw mail, keys, and coats all over the counters and chairs. I told Shannon this was such a source of stress for me. Why couldn't everybody just put their stuff away? And she explained that we could easily turn that area into a place of peace and productivity, a true functional space. We added a coat rack with key hooks and a small mail bin, and that has been a game changer. That's just one example of the difference she made.
Functional Spaces is based in the Triangle and serves Central North Carolina. If you're ready to experience that same transformation, go to functionalspacesnc.com and fill out the contact form. You will receive a link to schedule your discovery call to chat about your project area. Again, that's functionalspacesnc.com. Tell her your friends at Hard Times and True Crime sent you.
And this was in the 60s?
Yes,
Okay.
65. As they continued the investigation, they also found that the bodily organs had been cut up and flushed down the toilet.
Oh my gosh.
That was discovered later when the remnants were found in the city's sewer system. Obviously, the victims had been treated brutally after their death, but the extent of that and the cause of death would be difficult to determine since the corpses had been so mutilated. While it may have been difficult, it was not impossible, though. Researchers found that Fred had died from repeated blows to the head with a claw hammer, and they estimated that his time of death to have been 3 days earlier on June 20th, Father's Day of 1965.
Oh.
Edwina had been shot in the head, most likely execution style, before she was cut up. As each piece of the puzzle was put into place, investigators figured that the killer had drugged the bodies to the master bathroom to drain the blood from them before cutting them up.
Where's the son?
Right? That's what everybody's wondering.
Right.
Fred's eyes had been gouged out, and
Oh my gosh.
and his genitalia had been cut off.
Oh my gosh.
The precision of how this was done and the attention to detail led authorities to think that the murderer had an understanding of the human body and possibly some medical or anatomical training of some sort. I believe it points to somebody who had a vendetta. I mean, somebody really hated him to do that. Who in the world would do something so horrendous to the seemingly harmless old man?
Right.
And I'm going to put pictures of them on the website so you can just see how harmless this old couple look. Like, they don't look mean and scary.
Right.
At all. There was also a lack of blood in the house, which lent some credibility to the idea that the killer took quite some time to clean up his mess. Testing had shown the presence of a great deal of blood on the bathroom floor and in the tub, but it had been meticulously scrubbed. There was virtually no blood found in the house that hadn't been cleaned up, except on the step to their son's bedroom, which had recently also been scrubbed clean, as well as the kitchen floor, where traces of blood were found in both of those places.
Okay.
And there was one more place. The keyhole to their son Charles's attic bedroom door had a trace of blood that was left behind. Entering Charles's room, the police found that he was set up to pretty much kind of live up there in that area. He had a hot plate, dishes, cans of food, a coffee pot, and he had a ham radio. So he didn't have to actually go downstairs that often.
Yeah.
But still, Charles wasn't even in there. He was nowhere to be found. So they were like, well, could the killer have killed him and put his body somewhere? Are we going to find his body pieces?
Yeah.
But officers were really actually already starting to suspect that maybe Charles needed to be looked into, and maybe instead of being taken or killed, that maybe he could have done this. He was said to be extremely intelligent, and he had a keen interest in ham radios, which was not actually that uncommon in the 1960s.
Yeah.
That was actually kind of a big thing in the 60s. And Charles, he held a bachelor's degree in nuclear physics.
Wow.
He could speak 7 languages. So when I say he was smart, like, that's not an exaggeration at all.
Yeah.
After getting his degree, he served as a pilot for the U.S. Navy during World War II, and he lent his expertise to the Office of Naval Intelligence.
So he was brilliant.
Yeah. After the war, he had gone to work as a seismologist. That's somebody who, like, studies earthquakes.
Okay.
And he worked for Shell Oil Company. He was actually involved with Civil Air Patrol, and that was where he became acquainted with a man named David Ferry. And David Ferry was a man who had actually at one point been accused of being involved in JFK's assassination.
Huh.
And I'll come back around to that.
Yeah.
Despite all these accolades and accomplishments that Charles had, people did describe Charles Rogers as being a bit odd, displaying strange behavior at times. It was strange that he had quit his job at Shell really suddenly after almost a decade. I mean, it was a good job.
Yeah.
And then had just moved him back in with his parents. One neighbor said he had lived beside the couple for 7 years, and he never even knew they had a son.
Wow.
He would only come in and out at night, and so he was almost like a recluse up there.
Yeah.
Another woman said that Edwina Rogers had confided in her that the son only came out of the bedroom when the parents were not home, and that he had previously argued with his father and had choked him 5 times already.
Oh, gosh.
Sometimes when he would even speak to his parents just by pushing notes under the door. Like instead of coming out and speaking to them face to face, he'd just stick a note out the door like what he wanted or needed. So it was a bizarre,
That's a weird relationship.
Very, yes. Within just a day or two after looking at all the evidence, investigators felt that Charles was their suspect. And in fact, they didn't have any other suspects at all. There were no signs of forced entry into the house. Charles's weird behavior and the fact that he was mysteriously missing made him the prime suspect. A lot of major red flags.
Yeah.
And the neighbors who had witnessed his actions, they didn't disagree. They did suspect him as well. But you still have to have evidence or proof.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just go on what you suspect or what the neighbors suspect. And so all they had were those blood stains that were found like on his keyhole to his door. And that was it. So a nationwide manhunt ensued for the 5'7", 140-pound, dark-haired Charles Rogers. But it seemed like he really had vanished. There was speculation that he had gone to Canada, and others thought he was most likely living as a survivalist in the East Texas wilds that he was known to visit for weeks at a time. They alerted nearby airports in case Rogers tried to leave the immediate area or maybe even leave the country. But without a recent photo to go on, the search was virtually hopeless. I mean, they literally had nothing. They didn't even have a proper motive, really.
Yeah.
So just weeks after Charles Rogers had gone missing, police picked up a man for disturbing the peace. One of the patrolmen on duty who grew up with Rogers thought that this man was him. When that man was questioned, he agreed, yes, I am Charles Rogers. However, it was all just a hoax.
That is crazy.
It is crazy. Fingerprints proved that the jailed man was actually 26-year-old William Hughes. Now remember, Charles is 43.
Yeah.
That's a big
weird.
stretch.
Yeah.
And when they asked him why he deliberately claimed to be Rogers, he replied, things were kind of slow around here. I thought they wanted me to say I was Rogers, so I did.
That is so weird.
It's as simple as that, he said. And then he said, kind of livened up the place a bit, didn't it?
Oh, my gosh.
But then he realized real quick that he was getting himself in some hot water, that this guy was wanted for like a horrible homicide. So he backed up real quick and said, no, I'm not. Then the fingerprints did prove that. So they let him off the hook. But
what an
idiot. I know. Why would somebody do that? But people do it.
Yeah.
People do. One very interesting theory did rise to the surface. In 1992, a book titled The Man on the Grassy Knoll, which was written about John F. Kennedy's assassination. The author's theory was that Charles Rogers was a CIA agent who had worked with Charles Harrelson to plan the assassination of JFK in 1963.
Wow.
In that book, the authors proposed that Charles's motive for killing his parents was because they had discovered his involvement with the assassination of the president.
Well, my gosh, did he have to go to that?
Right. It seems a little.
Yeah, that was a little extreme.
That's what authorities thought. They were like, but could that be a reason for murder?
Yeah.
And especially that kind of a murder? Like, there was obviously some kind of, like, that was a crime of passion almost.
Yes.
So I didn't find that likely either. The sheer, brutal
Brutality.
mutilation of those bodies just suggests a hatred.
Mm-hmm.
Those authors also write that Charles fled the country after the murders, and they suspected that he spent his last years in Guatemala, where he died of old age. But there really is a genuine lack of sources for that theory.
Yeah.
I mean, they wrote a whole book about it, but people say they just took a lot. There was a lot of speculation in that book, according to the critics of it. And I kind of agree.
Yeah.
That just doesn't hold water. But there was another book that came out titled The Icebox Murders.
Okay.
A different theory emerged about why he killed the couple. The authors of this book, the Gardeniers, they suggest that he was emotionally and physically abused as a child and even as an adult. The Gardeniers, now they're not investigators.
Okay.
They're actually accountants who ended up researching the case in great detail before they wrote this book. But I do believe their suggestion about the abuse could be a really good theory.
Okay.
Because just the kind of that murder and the way his dad was so brutally done.
Yeah.
You feel like maybe there was something to that.
Right. Yeah.
Just, based on what we heard at the beginning about the three offenders of that kind of a murder, a parricide, are typically severely abused, mentally ill, or dangerously antisocial.
Right.
And we do know he was antisocial already. But so anyway, and so I think just the sheer way these murders took place really give a lot of weight to that theory. In addition to that, I found the date of the killings, Father's Day, to kind of be significant. I could be reading way more into that than there is, but I don't know. I just felt like that was significant to me.
Yeah.
And it was his father that he mutilated the worst. Hugh and Martha Gardner, they did extensive interviews, and they state as a fact that he was abused as a child. They say that he was small in stature, bullied by other kids, and he became a loner. They tell about another side of Charles, though, the one who had a long-term girlfriend and communicated with people from all over the world via ham radio. He had a pilot's license, and he flew himself around the Sierra Madres looking for treasure at one time.
Wow.
So while we see on one hand this loner and this recluse, he had not always been that way.
Yeah.
And there definitely was another side to him. That book went on to suggest that Fred and Edwina were also forging Charles's name on loans that they were taking out in his name, and that they had been stealing from him as well. Charles was actually the owner of the house they all lived in, not the parents.
Wow.
He owned the house. In that book, his parents are painted as being devious con artists, and his father was a bookie at times.
Okay.
And so they suggest like maybe there were some money issues going on and that they were stealing from him. They say that there's a paper trail that financial transactions that led up to the murders tell the story of a financially motivated crime.
Wow.
I mean, I think it has to be more than financial. If he did it, I mean, that may have been the straw, but I think there had to have been something way deeper than that if it was him. They say that his ham radio hobby, along with his connections made while working at Shell, helped him make connections that later helped him escape to Mexico. They uncovered some information that led them to believe that he died in the Honduras after being killed in a wage dispute with miners. But once again, critics of that book say that they just took a lot of creative license and made a lot of speculation without evidence to back it up.
Okay.
Nevertheless, the manhunt for Charles never turned up anything. He never resurfaced.
Crazy.
And that search came to a dead end. 10 years after the murders, a judge legally declared Charles Rogers dead. And just like that, the prime suspect would no longer be hunted.
Wow.
So if Charles was still living and if he committed those heinous acts against his parents, then he walked away scot-free.
Insane.
It really is. In the aftermath, the house at Driscoll Street remained empty. I mean, really, who would buy a house where that had taken place? I mean, that was atrocities. So in 1972, it was bulldozed by the city. And then that lot even stayed empty until the year 2000. And some developers ended up building some condominiums on it. But the fact is, we don't know who killed the Rogers family. And we certainly can't state that it was Charles.
Right.
I mean, he was the prime suspect, but that's all we know. And that case is unsolved to this day. So, do you think Charles killed his parents? Or do you think he was killed and his body was destroyed? Or what do you think?
I mean, I think that's just as possible that he didn't do it.
For the lack of evidence, we really don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any more evidence that he did it than he didn't. So, I'm going to choose to think he did. And I hope to God he did not do that to his parents.
But who else would have? I mean,
well, if he was a bookie, if that guy was a bookie, and if there was some criminal stuff going on there, then it's possible that,
that's a good theory.
Yeah, it's possible that, he got himself into some shady business. And
the only thing is those crimes were so violent.
Yeah.
Then I'm thinking if he did, it would have had to have been with like the mafia.
Yeah.
But I mean, in the 60s, who knows?
Right. I would hope that a son would never do anything like that. How could, I just cutting up your parents, that's insane.
Yeah.
And, well,
he did disappear. So,
yeah, that's true.
Either he was killed.
Met the same fate or,
but that was the story.
He probably did it.
I think that he did.
Yeah,
But,
he probably did. But I hate, though. I mean, how do they know for sure that he was sexually abused?
No.
Okay.
No. Now, those authors, and I don't know if they even said sexually, they just said abused.
Okay.
Those authors, I bet what made you think that, though, is because
His genitalia.
Yes, which would lead you to think that.
Yes.
But some people say those authors were just speculating really big about
Okay.
that. I just felt like their theory had a lot of credibility based on the nature of the crime.
Yeah. Yeah. Golly, that's just terrible.
It is terrible.
And it's crazy that it was never solved.
Yeah, and I feel like 10 years was not very long. There's a lot of cold cases open today that are 30 years old or more.
Yeah, I wonder why.
Why would they declare him dead after just 10 years? It seemed like they just kind of,
open and shut it. That's weird. I feel like they should go back and reopen that case.
Yeah, I do too. But
wow.
Anyway.
Those were some hard times.
Well, they sure were.
Now, I don't have a degree in psychology, mostly just because I didn't feel like getting one. But I don't see that we need multiple categories for the type of person that commits parricide. I feel like anybody that fully commits to that decision, regardless of what type of container you shove them into when you're done, you're going to fit neatly into that mentally ill category. But don't worry, it's a proven scientific fact that not a single person alive today has ever been murdered by their children while they were listening to hard times and true crimes. So you make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check us out. Till next time, goodbye.